Once upon a time, in a small city of Tenge, Reby was the youngest branch manager at 30 in his bank's history. He had built a reputation of being sharp, ambitious and disciplined, often working late hours at the bank. He drove a sleek car, lived in a high-rise apartment in the city, and enjoyed the admiration of his colleagues. To outsiders, his life seemed perfect. But beneath the polished surface, Reby was struggling with loneliness. His work consumed him, and the brief relationships he'd had with some women always ended the same way, in which they accused him of being too busy, too distant, or too closed. Reby had a predictable daily routine. He leaves for work at 7 a.m. every morning, grabs a coffee from the cafe across the street, and drives to the bank. Every evening, he took the same route home. He rarely strayed from this routine until one particular night. As Reby drove home late from work, he saw her for the first time. Her name was Onome. She sat by the corner of the street near his apartment. Her clothes were dirty, torn, and her hair unkempt. She often speaks to herself. Most people in the neighborhood avoided her, speeding up their pace as they passed, but Reby felt drawn to her for reasons he couldn't explain. Over the next few weeks, he noticed her in the same spot. Sometimes she laughed at nothing. Other times, she argued loudly with people who weren't there. Yet, there were moments when her face softened and she stared at the sky with an expression that was almost serene. Reby found himself stopping to talk to Onome after work. At first, their conversations were brief. She spoke in riddles, her thoughts scattered. But as time went on, Reby realized that beneath her chaotic words was a woman who had once been bright and full of potentials. Reby gave her listening ears and was interested in it. Onome was intelligent and communicative when her mind was clear, but she often slipped into confusion. She'd laugh at jokes he didn't make or cry without warning. Despite this, Reby found himself looking forward to their conversations. One evening, it started raining heavily when Ubo was on his way back from the bank. As he approached his apartment, he saw Onome huddled under a tree, shivering, and he stopped by. He hesitated for a moment, then made a decision that would change his life forever. "Come inside the car so we'll go to my apartment," he said. Onome looked at him in surprise. "You want me to follow you to your apartment? You'll catch pneumonia if you stay out here, just for tonight," he said, avoiding her gaze. Onome hesitated, but eventually nodded. Reby took her in his car and drove to his apartment, gave her a towel and one of his old sweaters, and made her a cup of tea. She sat on his couch, looking out of place, yet oddly comfortable. "This is nice," she said, her voice so calm and soft. Reby smiled faintly. "It's just an apartment." "To you, maybe?" Onome replied. "To me, it's a palace." That night, Onome stayed on Reby's couch. He told himself it was a one-time act of kindness, but the next day, when she thanked him and left, he couldn't stop thinking about her. Over the following weeks, Reby and Onome's connection deepened. She began spending more time in his apartment, sometimes sleeping on the couch when the nights were too cold. Reby learned more about her, having sharp sense of humor, her love for books, and the moments when her mind seemed to betray her. One night, after a particularly vulnerable conversation, Onome began to cry. Reby moved to comfort her, and before he realized what was happening, their lips met. The kiss was hesitant at first, then urgent. Onome knew it was wrong. Onome was vulnerable, and he was in a position of power. But, in that moment, he didn't care. He felt a connection he hadn't felt in years, a sense of being needed, of being seen. That night, they crossed a line that couldn't be undone. The morning after, Onome was still asleep, her face peaceful for the first time since he met her. He watched her for a moment, his heart heavy with guilt. When Onome woke up, she didn't seem to regret what had happened. "You're different from everyone else," she said, smiling. "You see me, not just the mess I've become." Reby didn't know how to respond. He cared for Onome, but he also knew their situation was complicated. She was still living on the streets most of the time, and he didn't know how to help her without feeling like he was taking advantage of her. For a while, things went back to normal. Reby tried to focus on his work, but he couldn't stop thinking about Onome. She continued to visit him occasionally, and their connection remained strong, though Reby tried to keep things platonic. Then one evening, Onome showed up at his apartment with tears in her eyes. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice trembling. Reby felt the world tilt beneath him. He stared at Onome, his mind racing. This couldn't be happening. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Onome nodded. "I've been to the clinic. They confirmed it." Reby sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. His mind was filled with questions and fears. How could this have happened? What would people say? How could he raise a child with a woman who wasn't stable? But as he looked up at Onome, he saw the fear and vulnerability in her eyes. She wasn't asking for anything. She just needed him to know. Reby knew he couldn't abandon Onome or the child. Despite his fears, he decided to take responsibility. He found a small apartment for Onome and helped her move in. He made sure she attended her prenatal appointments and brought her healthy meals. The months that followed were some of the most challenging of Reby's life. His colleagues began to notice his distracted behavior, and rumors started to spread. He told no one about Onome, fearing judgment and ridicule. Onome struggled and managed the pregnancy for 9 months despite her mental challenges. She gave birth to a boy they named Okita. Reby was overwhelmed with emotion. As he held his son for the first time, he realized that despite the chaos and uncertainty, this child was a part of him. Reby's decision to support Onome and Okita wasn't without consequences. His reputation at work suffered as he juggled his responsibilities as a father and a bank manager. Friends and family questioned his choices, and some distanced themselves from him. But Reby didn't regret his decision. Onome, though still struggling with her mental health, found stability in her new role as a mother. Okita became the anchor that held them both together. Over time, Reby realized that love doesn't always come in the form you expect. Onome wasn't the partner he had imagined, but she taught him the value of compassion, resilience, and unconditional love. Though their journey was far from perfect,